Sir, please don't let him send me away. The words slipped out before Elena Carter could stop them, soft enough to sound almost like a prayer, yet steady enough to turn the air inside Roman Vale's private dining room still. The crystal chandelier above them cast a clean white glow across the polished table, the silverware, the untouched wine, and the woman standing at the edge of all that wealth with a linen apron tied neatly at her waist. Elena had been serving meals in this hotel for 3 years, but tonight she had stepped into the wrong room at the wrong time. And now the man seated at the head of the table was watching her with the kind of silence that made everyone else suddenly aware of their own breathing. Roman Vale did not move. He simply lifted his dark eyes from the folder in front of him and studied the small tremor in her hands, the way she kept one shoulder slightly turned, as if protecting something hidden beneath her composure. The guests around the table, men in tailored jackets and women dripping in soft perfume, had gone quiet too, not because they were kind, but because they had recognized Roman's attention and understood that attention from him was never accidental. Elena swallowed and looked toward the manager waiting near the doorway, a man with a polished smile that had already turned sharp. He had spoken to her moments ago as if she were invisible, then as if she were a mistake. He had told her she was too slow, too careless, too unimportant to stand in this room much longer. Roman's expression did not change, but something in the atmosphere did, as if the entire dining room had taken one careful step backward without moving its feet. Elena knew better than to hope for help from powerful men. Life had taught her that people with money rarely noticed the ones cleaning up after them, and when they did, it was usually to correct them, not protect them. But tonight, with her voice still hanging in the air and every eye on her, Roman set his fork down with deliberate calm and asked, "Why are you asking me?" Elena's throat tightened. She had not meant to speak to him at all. She had only meant to keep her job, keep her dignity, and get through one more shift without being embarrassed in front of a room full of strangers. Yet something in his tone was different, controlled but not cruel, cold but not empty. So she answered honestly. "Because he says I've already made one mistake," she said, glancing at the manager, then lowering her eyes again. "And because if I leave now, I won't be able to pay my mother's medical bill this week." For the first time, Roman looked at her as if he were seeing the whole person, not just the uniform. The room stayed perfectly still. Roman did not look away from Elena when the manager shifted uneasily at the head of the table. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the room uncomfortable, then folded one hand over the other with the kind of calm that made even wealthy men lower their voices. "Say that again," he told the manager, his tone quiet and precise. The manager swallowed, suddenly aware that every guest in the private dining room had stopped pretending not to listen. Elena stood there with her hands clasped in front of her apron, her face warm with embarrassment, already bracing for the moment when she would be told to leave. She had been told to leave before. Different restaurants, different faces, same look in their eyes, the same casual way of deciding she did not belong. But Roman was still watching her, and there was something unnerving about the fact that he seemed less interested in her mistake than in the man who had tried to use it against her. "I said she cannot remain on this floor," the manager repeated, his confidence thinning. She interrupted an important dinner. Roman leaned back slightly and glanced at the untouched place settings around the table. "No," he said. "You interrupted it." The words were not loud, but they landed with enough force to silence the room completely. One of the men at the table cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. Another shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by the stem of his glass. Elena could feel her pulse in her wrists. Roman had not defended her in the way she expected. He had not spoken softly to calm things down, and he had not offered her pity. He had taken the entire room and turned it back on the man who had tried to shame her. The manager forced a tight smile. "Sir, I was only trying to maintain standards." Roman's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Then your standards need work." Elena blinked at that, unsure whether to breathe or move. She had spent so long trying to become invisible at work that being seen this clearly felt almost dangerous. Roman turned his attention to her again, and his expression changed in a way that made her chest tighten. It was not kindness exactly, not yet. It was something more careful, as if he were measuring the cost of every word before he spoke it. "Your mother is ill," he said, as though confirming a fact he had already decided mattered. Elena nodded once, surprised he had remembered. Yes, sir. And you are working this shift to pay the bill? Yes, sir. The room stayed motionless. Roman looked toward the manager again. How much does she make here? The question hung in the air for a beat before the manager answered. Not enough to matter. Roman's gaze hardened. That was the wrong answer. Elena looked up at him then, startled by the flat certainty in his voice. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, withdrew a black leather wallet, and set a folded card on the table beside his untouched glass. She will finish her shift, he said. You will not speak to her again unless it is with respect. The manager stared at the card as if it had burned him. Elena did not know what was written on it, but she saw the sudden change in his face, the color leaving his skin. Whatever Roman Vale had just placed on the table, it was enough to remind the manager exactly who was in the room. Roman rose slowly, adjusting his cuff with a measured movement that made the entire private dining room feel smaller. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at Elena as if he intended his next words for her alone. When your shift is over, he said, you are going to tell me how long your mother has been sick, what hospital she is in, and why a woman with your work ethic is still being treated like an inconvenience. Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. No one had ever asked her questions like that before. Not with this level of seriousness. Not with this much control. Roman held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod toward the hallway. Finish your work, he said. Then come find me. And as he turned away from the table, the guests in their tailored suits, the manager in his polished shoes, and Elena in her simple black uniform all understood the same thing at once. The balance of power in that room had shifted, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. By the time Elena returned from the hallway, the private dining room had changed. The laughter that had filled the space earlier was gone, replaced by the kind of quiet that made every movement sound too loud. Crystal glasses sat untouched on the table. The candles still flickered, but their light now seemed thinner, as if even the room itself understood that something important had shifted. Elena kept her tray close to her chest and walked back in with careful steps, her face calm in the way people learn to look calm when their whole life depended on it. Roman was still there, standing near the head of the table with one hand in his pocket, his suit jacket hanging perfectly on his shoulders. He was not speaking. He did not need to. People like him rarely had to raise their voices to control a room. The manager, however, was beginning to unravel. His smile had turned stiff, his fingers kept brushing against the edge of the table, and every now and then his eyes darted toward Roman, as if hoping the moment would disappear on its own. It did not. Elena set down a fresh glass of water beside one of the guests, and the guest barely noticed her. That should have made her feel invisible, but somehow it only made her more aware of how fragile her place in the room really was. One wrong word, one wrong motion. One man in a polished suit could decide whether she kept her job or walked home with nothing. Roman watched her with an expression that gave away very little, yet his attention never left her. It was not the casual glance of a man amused by a waitress. It was something steadier, something that seemed to be measuring the weight of every silence in the room. Elena felt it in her chest and looked down quickly, embarrassed by the strange pressure of being seen. She was used to being overlooked. She was not used to being noticed by a man like him. When she reached the far end of the table, the manager cleared his throat and tried to recover his authority. Elena, the wine service for this course is delayed, he said, too loudly, as though volume could restore dignity. You should have been more efficient. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Elena lowered her eyes and nodded, though the words landed on her like a familiar bruise. She had heard that tone before. From landlords. From doctors. From people who believed urgency was always proof of their own importance. Roman turned slightly, his jaw tightening just enough for Elena to notice. Then he spoke, not to the manager first, but to her. Did you hear that clearly? He asked. Elena looked up, unsure what he meant. His gaze remained steady, controlled, almost gentle. Yes, sir, she said. Roman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then looked back at the manager. You speak to her as if she is the problem, he said, each word measured and calm, when she is the only person in this room actually doing her job. The manager opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. The guests were staring now, no longer pretending to be interested in their plates. Elena froze, tray in hand, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Roman did not raise his voice. That was what made it worse for the man standing across from him. If the service is delayed, Roman continued, then you address it without humiliation. If something needs to be corrected, you correct it without turning an employee into a target. He let that settle for a second, then added, that is basic respect. It should not be difficult to understand. Elena stood very still, waiting for the usual ending. A warning, a dismissal, the familiar sting of being made small in front of strangers. But Roman did not give the manager the chance to recover his footing. Instead, he looked back at Elena and said, finish your shift. And after that, I expect you to come speak with me. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the room quiet again. Elena blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. Speak with him. Not to him. Not at him. With him. For a moment, she almost forgot where she was. Around her, the guests exchanged glances. The manager had gone pale. Roman's tone remained even, but there was something unmistakable in it now, something protective and final. Elena lowered her head once more, though this time it was not from shame. It was from the overwhelming effort of holding herself together. And in that silence, while the candles burned low and the table remained still, she began to understand that Roman had not simply noticed her. He had chosen her side. Elena stood in the quiet room with her tray held close, feeling the weight of every eye that had once dismissed her. The manager had gone rigid near the head of the table, his face carefully arranged, but the color had already drained from it. Roman remained seated, calm and unreadable, one hand resting near his glass, as if the entire room had merely paused to wait for him to decide what came next. No one spoke. Even the soft clink of crystal seemed too loud now. Elena could feel her pulse in her throat, not because she was afraid of Roman, but because she could not understand why he had done this for her, why a man like him would draw such a clear line between her and everyone else in the room. She had spent so many years learning how to become invisible that being seen like this almost felt unbearable. Roman finally looked up at her and said, in a voice low enough to keep the room in its silence, you do not need to apologize for anything in this room. Elena swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened around the tray. She wanted to look away, but something in his expression held her there. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was something steadier, something that made her feel, for one unsettled moment, as if she were standing on ground that had just become solid beneath her feet. The manager cleared his throat and tried to recover his authority. Mr. DeLuca, if there is a concern, I can certainly handle it quietly. Roman did not even turn his head. You already handled it, he said, his tone still even, still controlled, and you handled it poorly. The words landed without heat, which somehow made them sharper. Around the table, the guests shifted in their chairs. One woman lowered her eyes to her plate. A man a few seats away stared down at his folded hands as though he might disappear into them. Elena could feel the change spreading through the room, subtle but unmistakable, like the first movement of a tide. Roman set his glass down and leaned back slightly. Elena, he said, and hearing her name from him sounded different than hearing it from anyone else. How long have you worked here? She hesitated before answering, because no one in that room had ever asked her a question as if the answer mattered. 3 years, she said at last. And before this job? Roman asked. She blinked, unsure where this was going. I cared for my younger brother after our father left. I worked wherever I could before that. The room was still again, but now it was a different kind of stillness. Not the silence of judgment, the silence of attention. Roman's gaze remained on her, steady and intent. He seemed to measure every word she did not say. And you are still sending money home, he said. It was not a question. Elena's throat tightened. Yes, she admitted. For my mother. The manager shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation had moved away from him. He tried once more, softer now. Sir, with respect, this is not the proper time. Roman finally looked at him. Then when would be the proper time? He asked. After she has been dismissed? After she has been spoken to like she is beneath the floor? The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. Roman's face remained calm, but his words carried a weight that made the entire table feel smaller. I asked her to stay because I wanted to hear what kind of woman could stand here and remain composed while being treated with so little dignity. Elena felt those words in a place she had not expected. She had not felt composed. She had felt close to tears, close to breaking, close to running out of the room with shame burning in her face. But Roman had seen something different. He had seen effort. He had seen restraint. He had seen the kind of strength that did not announce itself. One of the guests finally spoke, trying to smooth the atmosphere with a nervous laugh. "Well, that is certainly unexpected." Roman did not return the smile. "What is unexpected," he said, "is how quickly people confuse a uniform with a person's worth." The room went quiet again. Elena lowered her eyes, not from humiliation this time, but because the emotion rising in her chest had become too large to hold in front of so many strangers. She had spent years being told to keep her head down, to stay useful, to stay unnoticed. Now she stood in a room full of people and realized that Roman had not simply interrupted her humiliation. He had exposed it. And in doing so, he had made room for something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Roman did not move for several seconds. He sat at the head of the table, one hand resting near his glass, his expression calm enough to be mistaken for indifference, though Elena could now see the tension hidden beneath it. The room had gone so still that even the candles seemed to burn more quietly, their light trembling across the polished surface of the table and the untouched plates set before the guests. Elena kept her tray close to her chest and forced herself to breathe slowly. She had spent so many years trying to make herself small that standing in the middle of all that attention felt almost unbearable. Yet Roman did not look at her like she was a burden. He looked at her like she mattered. The manager cleared his throat, trying to recover his authority with a careful smile that no one seemed to trust. "Mr. Bianchi, I assure you there was no intention to cause discomfort." Roman's gaze did not leave him. "Then perhaps," he said in a low, even voice, "you should learn that discomfort is exactly what happens when people are treated without respect." A few of the guests lowered their eyes. One man at the far end shifted in his chair. The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again when Roman lifted his hand slightly, not in anger, but in quiet command. "Bring Elena a chair," Roman said. For a second, no one moved. Then one of the staff members hurried to obey, placing a chair beside the table as carefully as if the room itself might break if handled too roughly. Elena blinked, unsure what to do with this sudden kindness. She had never been invited to sit among people like these. She had spent her life standing behind polished silver and crystal glasses, making sure everyone else was comfortable while she remained invisible. Roman's voice softened just enough for her to hear. "Sit down." The words were simple, but they carried a weight she could feel in her chest. Elena hesitated, glancing at the manager, who now looked as though he wished the floor would open beneath him. Then, slowly she sat. The chair felt strange beneath her, almost unreal. A woman at the table looked startled. Another guest stared at Elena as though the sight of a server seated near the center of the room was somehow impossible to process. Roman ignored them all. "Tell me," he said, his attention returning to Elena. "How long have you been carrying this kind of pressure?" Elena looked at her hands, then at the quiet faces around the table. No one had ever asked her that before. Not once. The question caught something fragile inside her, something she had kept folded away for years. "Long enough," she said at last, her voice barely steady. Roman studied her for a moment, and in that silence she felt something shift again, deeper than the first moment of defense. It was not pity. It was recognition. "That is not an answer," he said gently. "It is what people say when they have been left to endure too much alone." Elena swallowed hard. The truth sat just behind her teeth, heavy and impossible. She had been holding 2 jobs, caring for her mother after long shifts, paying medical bills she never spoke about, and still smiling through every insult because she needed the work. She had learned to keep moving even when her heart felt worn thin. And now, in front of a room full of strangers, Roman seemed to understand all of it without her saying another word. The manager finally found his voice again, though it was much weaker than before. "If there is any misunderstanding, we can certainly discuss this privately." Roman turned his head slightly. "No," he said. "What happened here was public. The correction will be public too." The words landed with such quiet force that even Elena felt them straight in the air. For the first time that evening, no one seemed certain of their place in the room except her. And as Roman sat there without a trace of hesitation, defending her in front of people who had dismissed her only minutes earlier, Elena began to realize that the floor beneath her life had already started to change. The room did not return to normal after Roman spoke. It simply changed shape, as if everyone inside had been forced to stand in the presence of something larger than themselves. Elena remained where she was, one hand still wrapped around the tray handle, her fingers no longer trembling the way they had at the beginning of the evening. The manager stood near the end of the table with his mouth slightly open, his confidence gone so completely that he looked almost smaller in his expensive shirt. Roman did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He only looked at the man long enough for the silence to do the work for him. Then, with the same measured calm, he asked for the guest list, the service notes, and the name of the person who had approved the seating arrangement. The manager hurried to comply, fumbling through his own pride as if it had suddenly become too heavy to carry. Elena watched all of it with a strange, disbelieving ache in her chest. Only an hour earlier, she had been moving through the dining room as if she were part of the furniture, careful not to disturb anyone, careful not to be noticed. Now every eye in the room kept drifting toward her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the man at the head of the table had made sure they could no longer pretend she was invisible. One of the guests cleared his throat and tried to smile as if this were all some misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a little charm. Another stared down at his untouched glass, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Roman, however, remained composed. He reviewed the papers the manager handed over, his expression unreadable, and then he said quietly that the evening would continue only under better terms. There would be no more humiliation, no more careless jokes, no more treating the staff as if their presence were an inconvenience. His words were not dramatic, and that made them stronger. They settled over the table with the weight of a decision that had already been made. Elena lowered her eyes for a moment, not because she was ashamed, but because she was struggling to hold back the emotion rising in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had spoken on her behalf with that kind of certainty. Her late mother used to tell her that dignity was not something people handed out freely. It had to be guarded, even on the hardest days. Elena had learned that lesson young. She had learned it in small kitchens, on cold mornings, on buses she could barely afford, and in the quiet spaces between one insult and the next. But tonight, standing in the glow of low candles and polished glass, she felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being seen. Roman finally looked at her again, and the steadiness in his face softened by the smallest degree. It was not pity. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. Elena did not know how he had understood so much so quickly, or why he had chosen to protect her when everyone else had chosen silence. But she knew one thing with growing certainty. Nothing about this evening was accidental anymore. When the manager began apologizing to the table in a strained, rehearsed voice, Roman lifted one hand and stopped him. Then he turned his attention back to Elena and asked, in a tone so calm it almost felt gentle, whether she was still able to finish her shift. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her what she needed all night. No one had cared whether she was still standing only because she had forced herself to keep going. She swallowed hard and nodded once. Roman studied her for a beat longer, as though measuring the answer against the person giving it, and then he told her to take 5 minutes in the hallway, drink some water, and come back only when she was ready. The room remained silent as she stepped away, but this time the silence felt different. It was not the silence of power being used against her. It was the silence that follows judgment when everyone realizes the wrong person has been underestimated. And as Elena walked toward the door with her tray held a little more steadily than before, she understood that Roman had not merely interrupted the evening. He had changed the terms of it. By the time Elena returned from the hallway, the room had settled into a strange kind of stillness, the kind that did not come from comfort, but from being forced to recognize the truth. Her glass of water sat untouched on a small side table, and the fresh air she had breathed for those 5 minutes had not erased the ache in her chest, but it had given her just enough strength to walk back in with her chin lifted. No one looked amused anymore. No one leaned back in their chair with that careless confidence that had filled the room earlier. They watched her now in a different way, as if the simple act of her re-entering the dining room had become its own quiet statement. Roman remained at the head of the table, one hand resting near his folded napkin, his posture unchanged, yet somehow more present than before. He did not call attention to her. He did not need to. The room had already learned where his attention belonged. Elena paused near the doorway for half a second, adjusting her grip on the tray, and Roman noticed immediately. It was such a small thing, but that was what made him different. He did not just see the obvious moments. He saw the ones that happened between breaths. "You are all right?" he asked, not loudly, not for show, but with the kind of steady concern that made the words feel heavier than a speech. Elena nodded once, though her throat tightened as she did. She had spent so long in places like this learning how to survive by shrinking herself into the background that being noticed like this felt almost unfamiliar. Roman studied her for a beat, then gestured toward the empty chair beside him, not as an order, but as an invitation that changed the shape of the entire table. "Sit for a moment," he said. The manager looked as if he wanted to object, but the thought died before it reached his lips. No one interrupted now. No one dared to turn the moment into another performance. Elena stepped closer, not because she suddenly felt fearless, but because something in Roman's tone made resistance seem unnecessary. When she sat, the chair sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. A few people looked away. Others kept staring, uncertain what rules now applied. Roman leaned back slightly and turned to the table with the calm precision of a man who understood that dignity did not need to be announced to be enforced. He asked Elena whether she had eaten that day. The question landed softly, yet it exposed how little anyone else had considered her all evening. She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told him enough. His expression changed only a little, but Elena saw it. Not pity, not performance, recognition. "Then we will fix that," he said simply. One of the staff members hurried in with a plate, hands careful, eyes lowered, as if the room itself had taught him to move differently. Elena looked at the food, then at Roman, unsure what to do with the kindness that had arrived so abruptly it almost felt impossible. She had expected dismissal. She had expected the evening to end with her leaving quietly, carrying her humiliation home like something breakable wrapped in paper. Instead, she found herself sitting at the same table that had tried to make her invisible, while the man at its center spoke to her as though her presence mattered. The change was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was in the way the manager no longer spoke over her. It was in the way the others watched Roman before they decided how to breathe. It was in the way Elena's shoulders, still tense, had stopped curling inward. Roman asked her where she lived, and when she answered, he listened as if the detail mattered. He asked whether she walked home alone. He asked whether anyone waited for her there. Each question was simple, but together they built something Elena had not felt in a very long time. Safety. Not the kind that comes from walls or locks, but the kind that exists when someone with power chooses to use it carefully. And as the candles burned lower and the room stayed silent around them, Elena began to understand that what had changed that evening was not only the atmosphere. It was her place in it. She was no longer standing at the edge of other people's comfort, hoping not to be seen. She was at the center of a room that had finally been made to acknowledge her. The house had grown quieter after the dinner had ended, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged, as if the walls themselves were remembering what had happened at the table. Elena stood near the sideboard with her hands folded tightly around the edge of her tray, watching the guests move more carefully now, speaking in lower voices, laughing less freely, as though Roman's attention had changed the air they breathed. No one had asked her to leave. No one had told her to disappear. That alone still felt unreal. Roman remained at the head of the table, one sleeve pushed back slightly, his posture relaxed in the way only powerful men could afford, yet his gaze kept returning to Elena, as if he were making sure she was still standing on steady ground. When he asked her to sit for a moment, the room seemed to pause with the request. Elena hesitated, not because she wanted to refuse, but because she did not know how to accept kindness in front of an audience that had only recently denied her dignity. Still, she lowered herself into the chair he indicated, placing the tray carefully beside her. The manager, who had spoken so loudly earlier, now seemed to have discovered the value of silence. He kept his eyes on the table and his hands still, as if movement itself might invite another correction. Roman looked around once, slow and deliberate, and then his attention settled on Elena again. "You have been working since before the first course was served," he said, his voice even, carrying easily through the room. "Have you eaten tonight?" The question was simple, almost disarming in its plainness. Elena blinked, caught off guard by how much it mattered that he noticed. "Not yet," she answered quietly. Roman did not react with pity. He simply gestured toward a plate that had been left untouched near the end of the table and instructed the staff to bring it over warm. Elena's throat tightened. She had expected scrutiny, perhaps another test, perhaps even indifference after the earlier defense. She had not expected care. The room watched as though each person was learning a lesson they had not wanted. A woman in pearls shifted in her seat, no longer certain of her own certainty. One of the men who had smiled at the manager's cruelty now stared down at his glass, his face unreadable. Roman did not need to raise his voice to command the space. He had already done something far more difficult. He had made every person in that room aware of what they had allowed. Elena accepted the plate with both hands, careful and formal, and for a moment she simply looked at the food without touching it. Then Roman asked her a second question, softer this time. "Do you always work this late?" Elena nodded. "Most nights." "And who expects you home?" he asked. Again, the room went still. Elena hesitated, then answered honestly. "No one really. My sister lives across town, but she has 2 children and works early." Roman's jaw changed almost imperceptibly. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and heavier, something that seemed to gather in the quiet behind his eyes. "Then you should not be walking home alone," he said. It was not an offer made for display. It was a fact stated with the same cold certainty he might have used to settle a business matter. Yet that matter-of-fact protection reached Elena more deeply than any grand speech could have. She looked up at him and found no performance there, no desire to impress the room. Only a simple decision to make sure she was not left unprotected after being seen. The guests continued to eat, but more slowly now. No one interrupted her. No one laughed. Roman asked about the long commute she made every morning, and Elena, surprised by his attention, told him about the city bus, about leaving before sunrise, about the way winter wind cut through her coat at the station. He listened without drifting, without glancing away, as though the details of her life were not small at all. They were essential, and while she spoke, something in her posture changed. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. Her shoulders loosened. Her chin lifted. Her hands stopped trembling around the edge of the plate. She was still tired. She was still frightened of saying the wrong thing. But she was no longer shrinking. Across the table, Roman's expression remained unreadable to everyone else. Yet Elena had begun to sense the quiet shift beneath it. He was not merely watching her now. He was learning her. And in the strange, suspended stillness of that room, that realization felt more dangerous than the earlier humiliation ever had. Because humiliation could be survived. Being truly seen by a man like Roman Castellari meant something else entirely. It meant the life she had built around invisibility was no longer enough to protect her. It meant the future had entered the room before she was ready for it. When the servant returned to refill the water glasses, Roman did not look away from Elena. "Finish your meal," he said, not as a command, but with a steadiness that made it feel impossible to disobey. Elena lowered her gaze and took the first bite, and though the food was ordinary, the moment was not. Around her, the room remained hushed, every movement careful, every glance measured. For the first time that evening, Elena was not waiting to be corrected, dismissed, or laughed at. She was being treated like someone whose presence mattered. And Roman, still watching her with that same quiet intensity, seemed to understand that the most lasting kind of power was not the power to silence a room. It was the power to make someone feel safe enough to speak. By the time the last guests finally gathered their coats and the chandeliers had dimmed to a softer glow, the house no longer felt like a place built for performance. It felt like a place that had been forced, for one unforgettable evening, to remember what truth sounded like. Elena remained near the sideboard, her hands no longer trembling, though she could still feel the weight of every glance that had once judged her and now avoided her. The room had changed because Roman had changed it, but the deeper shift was inside her. She had spent so many years moving quietly through other people's lives, making herself small enough to be ignored, that she had almost forgotten what it meant to be met with steadiness instead of suspicion. Roman stood near the fireplace now, speaking with the last of the remaining guests in that same measured voice, calm and unmistakably in control, yet every so often his attention returned to her, as if nothing in the room mattered more than whether she was all right. When the final guest stepped out into the night, the The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was intimate, thoughtful, almost reverent. Elena looked toward the windows, where the dark glass reflected the soft gold of the room behind her, and she realized that nothing about her life would feel as simple as it had before. Not after being defended, not after being noticed, not after standing in a room full of powerful people and learning that dignity could still survive there. Roman crossed the room and stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to leave her space to choose. "You do not have to disappear here," he said quietly. His voice carried none of the showmanship that had filled the evening earlier. There was only certainty in it, and something gentler beneath that certainty, something Elena did not trust herself to name too quickly. She swallowed, then lifted her eyes to his. In them, she saw no impatience, no demand, no pity. Only a patient kind of respect that made her chest ache. "I am not used to staying where I am wanted," she said, almost in a whisper. Roman did not answer at once. He only regarded her for a long moment, as if he understood that some wounds did not close in one night, and that trust was not something a person could order the way they ordered a meal. Then he nodded once, slowly. "Then let that change begin here." Elena's breath caught, not because his words were loud, but because they were carefully chosen and impossible to mistake. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the strange and frightening comfort of being invited instead of tolerated. The house was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that follows a storm and does not yet know whether to heal or remember. Roman turned slightly toward the open door, then back to her, as if making one final decision that needed no witness. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will not be carrying trays if you do not wish to. We will speak about what you want, not what others expect of you." Elena stared at him, unsure whether she had heard him correctly, because no one had ever offered her a future that began with her own voice. The offer was not extravagant. It was something far rarer. It was respect. It was choice. It was the first honest step toward a life that belonged to her again. Her fingers slowly relaxed at her sides. The room remained still, waiting, as though even the walls understood that something permanent had shifted between them. And in that hush, Elena gave the smallest nod, one that carried more courage than any speech could have done. Roman saw it, and answered with a quiet look of approval that warmed the entire room more than the fire ever could. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No grand declaration. No applause. Only the soft closing of a door, the muted crackle of embers, and the sense that a woman who had spent years being overlooked had finally been given back to herself. And that night, as Elena stood beneath the fading light and Roman remained beside her in steady silence, the world seemed to remember a simple truth it had nearly forgotten. Dignity, once recognized, can change everything.